Hello, my name is Maureen. I'm a professor of psychology at National University in San Diego. I'm British, started out as a biologist in the UK, but I switched to psychology when I came to the US. And I've always been interested in the relationship between the outer cultural context and the inner psychological realities of people. It's probably because I'm an immigrant and I've seen that process of the relationship between the cultural context and my inner psychological world firsthand. In the last decade or so, I've been very interested in the whole question of future studies, and in particular, what the impact of the current cultural upheavals and transformations are on the psychological dimensions of life. And so I'm particularly interested in the way in which the contemporary challenges, the speed of change, the scope of change, and the depth of change is influencing us psychologically. I spent a few years in San Francisco, a city which is actually the sort of epicenter of the rapid change, as president of Saybrook Graduate School, University. But now I'm joyfully back in the ranks of the professoriate, and then currently enjoying a sabbatical in France. So this is a particularly enjoyable opportunity to participate in this project. I suppose my interest in cultural psychology was inevitable, given that my own personal experience is that I've lived in the old world in working class Yorkshire, I've lived in the new world in California, and I've lived in the Anglo world. I've lived in the Latin world. I lived in Brazil for a while. I've also been a bench scientist, and so I've lived in the culture of science. I've been a social psychologist. I've been a psychotherapist, so I've lived in that sort of microculture of individual psychotherapy. And I've also been an artist. And so living in these multiple cultures has sort of brings it home to you that the context in which one is operating has a lot to say about how you see the world and how you experience life and reality. But I think it really was brought home to me how important these questions of culture are. When I was working as a therapist and in San Diego, where a lot of the people in San Diego are cross-border people, and I was working with a young woman who was the daughter of a Zapotec Indian from Mexico. She'd migrated to the US as a teenager. She'd married an American who was of Swedish descent. His father was a prairie Protestant preacher. He was a musician. She was a corpsman in the Navy. And she juggled her various cultural identities, but she always felt like an immigrant everywhere. Even when she went back to Mexico, she was the ninth child of a large family. She felt like an immigrant there too. And working with her prompted me to really spend some time learning more about this very deep relationship between culture, context, and the inner psychological realities. And since then, I've worked in Brazil, in Japan, in the US, the UK, France, Austria, and all of those contexts are different. And so I was looking at the psychology of people in these various contexts, but realizing that the psychology that I was taught as a student and the epistemologies it embraces is actually culturally situated, and it isn't a universal. And it's in fact, in a sense, it's the indigenous psychology of Western European modernists. Now, the American psychologists and British psychologists have been very slow to recognize that consciousness is, in fact, not some kind of universal given, but it's a product of culture, and that culture is an emergent construction by the conscious individuals and groups in that particular environmental setting. Now, drawing on my biology background, I realized that though the neuropsychological limits define what we're capable of, this is sort of our shared bedrock human psychology, or the genotype, if you like, the working mentalities of each culture is actually different, and we could sort of consider this to be the phenotype. And so, just as in the organic world, phenotype is a product of the environment or ecosphere, the consciousness is also the product of the environment, or what I've called the psychosphere. And I've defined psychosphere to include a sort of holistic, interconnected, and interpenetrated system of symbols, representations, language, metaphor, patterns of life, values, epistemologies, governance, cognitive habits, rituals and religions, even sports, forms of commerce, metaphysics, art, technology. And as long as they're stable enough, they're not sort of like changing every half hour, these provide the raw materials of our identity and our individual and social behavior. Now, in the past 2 decades, there's been a great deal of research into the brain and the mind and the relationship between mind and culture, and a complex picture is emerging. Human consciousness is an open system, and it's the product of an ongoing interaction between the biological, neurological substrate, psychological systems like identity and cognitive schemas and so on, and the specific psychospheres in which any particular individual or group lives. Research has shown cultural differences in attention, or what people notice, in perception, what they actually see in a scene, their motivation, what they'll strive to achieve, in meaning, how they make sense of things, what they retain from their experience, neuroplasticity, how the brain actually lays down the neurological patterns, and emotional patterning, how the brain pathways develop in response to specific emotionally challenging or provocative experiences. So people raised in Asian societies, for example, are much more likely to perceive patterns, relationships, and qualities. But Europeans and Americans are more likely to see isolated objects, identities, quantities, and to see things more in terms of their individual qualities. The self-structures of Americans are more egocentric and individualistic than those of either Asian populations or tribal groups. And though all children at birth could learn to speak any language without an accent, after about 7 or 8, most of us would have difficulty learning sounds that don't exist in our native language. Now, there are linguistic specialists who can do that, but most of us would not be able to develop a second language without an accent much after 8 or 9. Now, when these systems are stable and homogeneous, the outer world and the inner world of the inner psychological world are, in a sense, resonant and coherent. The narratives are shared through which to explain to each other and to newcomers the existential facts of life, the way things are. So, for example, how do you explain that some people are rich and some people are poor? Or what's the origin story of your society? And this is true even for small societies like the bowling club or the Girl Scouts or the organization that you belong to. And it's also true of civilizations, that any organization will have an origin story. They'll all talk about how the company got created, or what the essential values were that drove its creation. And all stories are told over and over again to newcomers so that they sort of get it, what the facts of life are around here. And so in a stable and coherent situation, there's no cognitive dissonance between expectations about what would happen or ways of interpreting or understanding the things that we meet in the world. And it's this kind of stability and coherence that leads to the cultural diversity in ways of being that we can see in the world, and that a course in cultural competencies is actually aimed at. But as we know, upheavals occur through conquests, through occupation, through massive migrations, through mass die-offs due to war or famines, through natural and man-made disasters. And all of these will create a culture shock. And a culture shock, although the specific circumstances of the culture shock may be quite varied, a war or voluntary migration, the challenge to identity and to conceptual coherence, to values and sense of stability of mind, these are all fairly well-established universals that no matter where you move from one culture to another, certain things are predictable. And one of those is a very high level of anxiety and an insecurity and tentativeness. And this can be at both individual levels, but also can be at cultural and social levels. And what you can see is this sort of sense of uncertainty and bewilderment. And in the work that I've been doing over the last decade with the International Futures Forum in St Andrews in Scotland, we've been looking at this sort of current period in human history where all of the givens, all of the cultural anchors, all of the aspects of life that used to give stability to identity and to a sense of being are in a sense all up for grabs. That we have a lot, the anchors to cultural patterns of life are all being renegotiated. And they're being renegotiated from the political level. Our relationship with our environment is being renegotiated. We are facing for the first time the massive impact that we're having on planet Earth, which is something that earlier in our history we didn't really think about much. And we're also recognizing that we're all part of one planet and that the planet is inhabited by people of great diversity. And whereas historically we could avoid that, or when we met in conflict, these days we know we have to get along. We have to be on one planet no matter how diverse we are. And this is creating an incoherent situation which some have identified as a sort of a crisis of coherence. Sigmund Bauman calls this as the situation of liquid modernity. Now, what we know in this kind of situation where everybody is, where anxiety is very high and incoherence is very high, is that there's some predictable responses to that kind of turbulence. The commonest is a sense of is really a kind of a fear and control response, where you, out of fear of the uncertainty and the anxiety, steps are taken to try to control things, to try to simplify things, the sort of keep it simple, stupid sort of approach, where we look for ways to make life seem simpler, even if it really isn't. And you often, denial is certainly one of the chief defense mechanisms against this kind of turbulence. And avoidance of complexity. There's certain kind of sociopathy and narcissism, the hypervigilance, favoring abstraction rather than getting into it and actually engaging with life. These are all mechanisms, alienation, isolation, these are all mechanisms for trying to reduce the complexity. So is fundamentalism, authoritarianism, enforcing rigid structures, controlling boundaries, sectarianism, an increased focus on security, gated communities, anti-immigrant feelings, the NIMBYism. These are all methods for trying to avoid actually dealing with the complexity that's before us. Now, most of the time, these mechanisms will only work for a certain length of time, and often, eventually, they break down. And another response to this kind of turbulence is collapse, when all of the boundaries dissolve, when there's no structure at all, where we have anarchism and nihilism and open warfare, and change is often accomplished through force and through violence. We see this in the collapsed states and in situations where, in neighborhoods where the once reliable structures of daily life no longer work, and instead you have this sort of gang warfare and chaotic and violent and structureless chaos. But we also know that in these are also the kinds of situations that if conditions can be created where the anxiety can be contained and bound in a way, that instead of a neurotic defense or a catastrophic collapse, there's also the possibility that you can have a creative transformation where the energy of the anxiety, in a sense, pushes a reformulation out of the chaos and out of the incoherence and out of the complexity. Actually can emerge a new level, a new higher order of organization, which actually has greater capacity and greater possibilities to deal with the ambiguity and with the challenges of life. And so our work is really about trying to identify where reactions to the complexity seem to be neurotic and fearful and control for the sake of simplification, or where there's a threatened collapse, and instead move it into a situation where that same complexity, that same turbulence can result in innovation and creativity. One of the things we did in our research at the International Futures Forum was we tried to look at situations where we could identify a transformational response to change, as opposed to a more rigidification, a closing down of complexity or a collapse. And we were looking at organizations which really seemed to have mastered complexity, mastered the uncertainty, and turned the uncertainty and turned the diversity of their situation into an opportunity for innovation. And what we were able to discover was that indeed there are situations where, despite the rapid change, despite the unpredictability of a situation where cultures are constantly in the blender and new possibilities are appearing and disappearing all the time, that there are organizations that have somehow been able to harness this level of complexity and to turn it into new possibilities. So, in a sense, what we're looking at is a world that is in so much transformation. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about people who live in the rainforest, people who live in Latin America, or live in Japan, or live in North America, live in San Francisco. Wherever you look, you see a world which is transforming itself very, very rapidly. The early 21st century isn't just an era of change, but by all accounts, it's a change of eras. We're, in a sense, all immigrants. None of us are native in this new world that's emerging. As I say, it's what Zygmunt Bauman has called liquid times, where the anchors of stability and identity and competence are all in flux everywhere. And this is creating existential anxiety on a global scale. Now, the evidence for how scary this is for human beings may be seen in the World Mental Health Association statistics, which show a rapid increase in mental distress. They've called it a global mental health pandemic. So there's no question that this level of transformation, turbulence, is having serious casualties. But also, it's producing the conditions for a great deal of interest in innovation and, of course, a great deal of interest in change management. So what about the point really here is that there is no legacy mentality or legacy culture that is adequate to delivering effective action in a world that is now complex beyond our capacity to understand or control. Now, it's tempting to offer a roadmap for how we might proceed in these turbulent times, and many consultants are out there who are offering just that. There's training programs of all kinds to help people learn how to navigate turbulent times. But in our view, this would be to fall into the 20th century Western default of relying on expertise and technology to solve our way through the problem. And of course this is understandable because it's worked so well for 300 years. But today's problems are really not simple problems, and they're dilemmas, they're wicked problems, they're even super wicked problems, where attempts to solve just a piece of them often doesn't solve it at all, and actually creates other problems somewhere else in the system. So when we looked at organizations where somehow they were finding their way through into creative action out of very complex and unpredictable situations, what we found was that the technologies and expertise from previous eras are really not a good guide to success and to taking effective action in this kind of world. What we need to be able to do is learn our way through these complex situations. We have to take a learning stance, because none of the capacities that we had in the past are necessarily going to be all that useful in the new world. And certainly you can open any newspaper these days and you can see what happens when people try to use organizational or political solutions that worked very well 50 years ago in the new reality, and it just isn't working. That what we have to be willing to do is to take a more humble and learning stance, to use our capacities for empathy, for self-mastery, for relational sensitivity, for curiosity and courage. We have to be willing to make mistakes. And we also need, I guess, to be able to graciously ask for forgiveness when we do. In our view, it's not more theoretical knowledge that we need, although a good theory can certainly help organize collective thinking. But the kind of knowledge gained through reflective, thoughtful critique of what we do is more likely to be useful. As one of my colleagues said recently, it's more likely that we'll act our way into new ways of thinking than that we will think our way into new ways of acting. And obviously that's because we think in ways that derive from the culture that is no longer with us. And so acting creates new experience, it creates new interactions with the world as it really is today, rather than the world as it was. So in a sense, what I'm suggesting is that the future, or even the emerging present, is really a new culture. We are, in a sense, all immigrants, we are all having to learn, we're all in culture shock, and we're all faced with having to find our way in uncharted territory. And as any explorer will tell you, that when you're in uncharted territory, a compass is much more useful to you than a map. Of course, we should all take advantage of the various training programs that are out there and to do the work and the steps to solving complex problems. But in the end of the day, we really have to grow into new ways of being. We really have to grow into new ways of acting and new ways of understanding the world. We have to learn our way forward. In my view, we're collectively creating a new human psychology that isn't Latin, it isn't Asian, it isn't modern. It's a new emergent psychology that is adapted to the world as it's becoming. It's both local, because that's the only place we live, but it's also global, because all of us participate now in the hyper-connected global society. It's both individual, because one of the gifts of modernity is for us to recognize the importance of the sovereign, sacred individual. But it's also relational, because we can't be individuals without being in relationship. There is no self that's not in relationships with other selves. It has to be conservative and innovative. We have to conserve those things which we need to feel at home in our world, but it also needs to be innovative, willing to let go of those things and create new adaptations to the world as it's emerging. And one thing we can be sure of is that our children and grandchildren will be inhabitants of a new culture, and that whatever their legacy culture is, they're going to see the world in ways that we can't even imagine. So I think one of the important take-homes for me about what's going on in the world is that being culturally sensitive and culturally competent is an important skill for now. But being able to learn one's way into a culture that is just now being born will probably ultimately be the most important thing for all of us to learn as we move further into this brand new reality of the global century. And so I'm hoping that we can take what we've learned from our indigenous psychologies and our cultural psychology and our scientific psychology and our lived psychology and bring it to the work of creating a new civilization that can benefit from what humanity has learned so far, but also take on the huge challenges that face us in terms of climate change, in terms of diminishing resources, in terms of population overload, and so on. Because all of these problems are on a scale and of a nature that none of our indigenous cultures have prepared us to handle. And we will need to become new kinds of persons, or in the title of the book that my friend Graham Lester and I have just published, we all are going to have to learn to dance at the edge, because we're likely to be on the edge for quite some time to come.